Hi there, I'm Ahsan Ali, AA Shaw, and you're watching me on YouTube and Facebook Live. Today we are going to talk about time and space. I know what you're wondering is a bit technical and physics topic, but we are going to discuss it both from the scientific and tech and philosophical perspective, because both of these fields of studies have discussed this topic, time and space, in detail in different times. When we talk about time, time has a characteristic of an irreversible nature, and we the humans have invented and discovered the mechanicals, and today we have digital clocks to measure and calculate our existence here on Earth. Now, the question is it really the time of the universe? If it is not, then our time here on Earth, is it dependent upon the space or independent from the space? And to discuss this topic in detail and discuss in unorthodox way, I have a very special guest, and my guest is Edward Konowicz, and he is going to help me to figure out the mystery of time and space. Okay, he has joined us from Virginia, United States.
Yeah,
Hi,
hi
Ed.
everybody. Hey, I don't
How
know
are
if I'm special. I'm becoming a regular.
you? Mhm.
So,
Yes, you are.
yeah, we're going to be talking about time and space and discussing why
Mhm,
Einstein was wrong.
mhm. Okay, let me say this that you are, of course, a special person because now my audience and our audience is familiar with you, and I like your unorthodox views. Okay, how Einstein was wrong because the world perceived him as the renowned physicist and the most intelligent person in the past 100 years.
Yeah, I'm going to explain in very simple terms why
Mhm,
Einstein was incorrect, that
mhm,
everyone can understand.
mhm. Okay.
And of course, Einstein said time was relative,
Mhm,
but we have to understand time. And once we do, we understand it's relative in two different directions, not one.
mhm,
So what is the problem with science is we're given a one-way description and
mhm,
frequently there's a two-way description.
mhm,
Now let me explain. Einstein said time was relative and that gravity or acceleration slowed time,
yes, it's time dilation when people go
time
to space.
dilation, which
Mhm,
was it was expanded.
mhm,
But once you understand what time is, you know Einstein's incorrect. And
mhm,
I'm going to explain what time is.
mhm.
Time
I,
is setting a standard clock. To take or understand time, you need a clock.
mhm.
You can't have time without a clock.
Yeah, because it's interesting. Uh, we we invented clock according to the movement of the planet, and from our perspective, is it the clock of the universe?
Well, we it's still we need to translate that movement, whether we're looking at the rotation of the Earth for a day or the orbit of the Earth around the sun for a year, we
Mhm,
still have to translate that to an instrument
mhm,
because we can't measure, we can today, but the
mhm,
average person isn't going to measure the position of the Earth relative to the sun and the planets.
mhm.
They're not going to say, oh, let me check on the position of the Earth to give you the time. They're not going to do
Mhm.
that. So you need an instrument.
Yes.
Okay. And I'm going to prove to you Einstein was wrong.
Mhm. How?
Okay.
Mhm,
You need a set of reactions.
mhm,
Today we use either a cesium or
mhm,
an atomic cesium clock or an atomic aluminum clock, which is more accurate, to
Mhm.
measure reactions, vibrations of the atom
Mhm.
in order to estimate like a second or a millisecond, a nanosecond,
Mhm.
a femtosecond. We're using an instrument, okay?
Mhm.
But, but let me, an instrument is only measuring some event taking place, such as
Mhm.
the vibration of a cesium atom
Uh-huh.
or a vibration of aluminum atom, or the speed or cycling of radiation. You'll have some frequency
Mhm.
that you're setting as a particular unit, and you're measuring that frequency or that emission.
Mhm.
So, what time is, you're using some reaction. It could be the turning of the earth all the way around for a day, it could be the circling of the sun, it could be the vibration or emission
Mhm.
of an atom.
Mhm.
So, you're using some standard to take time.
Mhm.
Let me give you an example. The Earth doesn't rotate always at the same speed.
Mhm.
Given the gravity, particularly of Jupiter and our distance from the sun, not only our orbit, but our rotation is going to vary. It's not exact.
Mhm.
And even if it varies a little bit, just think about a second. A second of one day is 1/60, 1/parentheses 60 times
Then it will be.
60 times 24,
Mhm.
which is a very tiny amount of a day, and the Earth's rotation could vary given the different planets and other issues,
Mhm.
tidal forces with the moon,
Mhm.
and definitely our orbit around the sun varies. It's not always the same given the position of other planets. It's going to change, particularly in regards to 1 second, particularly in regards to a millisecond or a nanosecond or an um, what is that? 10 to the minus 10. I forget what that is. Um,
Mhm.
the the time is going to vary, and so you're using some standard. Now, the
Mhm.
standard we used to use is a pendulum clock. A pendulum will go back and forth,
Yes, a
and that's how
pendulum.
we would measure time.
Mhm.
But in greater gravity, the pendulum swings faster, which is
Mhm.
as you increase gravity, the pendulum clock goes faster.
Mhm.
But if you take a cesium or aluminum clock, where you're measuring the vibration or the radiation from an atom, in more
Mhm.
gravity, it goes slower. So Einstein's wrong. There's no such thing as time. You're looking at some standard reaction and using that as your reference.
Mhm.
And some standard reactions slow down under gravity and others speed up.
Mhm.
It's what reaction are you choosing as your basis of time?
So, does it have any role? Does gravity have any role in it?
Yes, gravity has a role in it, but it may slow up some reactions and it may speed up others. And so to say, well, gravity always um, s- slows up time
Mhm.
is is incorrect. That's only like 10, 20, 30% of the reactions slow up under gravity. Some go faster with gravity. And Einstein is assuming that all reactions behave the same way in regards to their rhythm or pace or the amount of events. And it's not true. Some reactions speed up in gravity, some slow up. So your clock determines what you choose as the reaction for you to measure time.
Mhm. Because it is important. What about the space time?
Space time. Well, space
Yes.
time is a buzzword. It's a buzzword to deal with relativity and the effect of gravity on time. So, in order to sound expert or official,
Mm-hmm.
the people who follow Einstein called it space time
Mm-hmm.
because he tried to claim in his general relativity that gravity was the distortion of space. And
Mm-hmm.
there's disagreement. I don't want to get into a big discussion on
Mm-hmm.
general relativity, but
Yes, because
I
yes,
want to
because
keep it to concepts everyone can understand.
yes.
That
We
time
could
is
discuss.
looking at some reaction. Could be a pendulum clock,
Mm-hmm.
could be cesium or aluminum or aluminium, depending on
Mm-hmm.
your culture,
Mm-hmm.
atoms, vibrations, or their emissions. You're using some reaction, some events that you're claiming are regular to reference your time, but not all events speed up or slow down in gravity. It depends on what event you're choosing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no abstract second. A second does not exist on its own.
Mm-hmm.
Is you're
So,
using some series of reactions to determine a second. Someone sets the standard. Let me
so
tell you
it
about, go
so
ahead.
it means that reactions are going to change when you change the circumstances or the variables.
Yes, why what you choose as your standard is going to
Uh-huh.
affect your time. It's like distance. It's recently been changed, but before 10 or 20 years ago, there was a meter stick, I think it was platinum in I think London, Paris, and Washington D.C. that was considered the standard meter length.
Mhm.
And it
What about
was
What about Einstein? What standard he used for his theory of relativity?
you got to say that louder and slower.
Uh, what standard did he use for his experiment on the theory of relativity?
You just use the regular laboratory equipment.
Mhm.
You are biased by what equipment you use.
Mhm.
It's not he used it. He looked at other people's experiments. He was one of the first physicists that really did not do applied physics. He didn't spend much time in a lab. He
Mhm.
looked at other people's work and measurements and
Mhm.
then drew his conclusions.
Mhm. So he was smart.
Oh, he was a genius. His
Yeah.
photoelectric effect deserved a Nobel Prize. His
Mhm.
estimation of Brownian motion for the relative size of atoms. He did brilliant work,
Mhm.
but it doesn't mean he's correct in everything he said.
Yes.
And
Yes.
he's a
That.
modern God. He's a modern Moses or Mohammed. You're not
Mhm.
supposed to question Einstein. And
Mhm.
I'm explaining in very simple terms. There's no clock in the universe.
Mhm.
There's no second.
Mhm.
You look at some reaction, some event, and that becomes your clock. But if you
Mhm.
look at a different event, it behaves differently.
Mhm.
So some reactions under gravity slow up, and some reactions, like the pendulum, speed up.
Mhm.
So
I
you
think.
can't generally say
Mhm.
time is slowed by gravity. You can't talk about space time because
Mhm.
he chose certain instruments to
Mhm.
measure time. Other instruments would measure it differently.
Mhm. So, does it explain that, for instance, if someone is going through a trauma, is going through a difficult phase, so that reaction slows down the time for a particular person. But if you are going through a happy time, then the time speeds up.
Yeah, well, it depends what you reference.
Yeah, it
Everything
depends
depends on
on.
your instrument. And
Mhm,
if all your instruments are going to be made with the same reference,
mhm,
then you have a bias in your observation,
mhm. I think that
which is
is.
your instrument somewhat determines your result.
Mhm. I think that's why our memory, we have a better memory on certain occasions and on unregular things. If we are going through a different place, if we are visiting a different place, going through a different experience, then our memory, we have a better memory. But if we are going through a regular thing, a casual thing, then we have a very fading memory.
Yeah, well,
Is
memory is a different thing. That's much more complicated.
Mhm,
Time is
big-
not that complicated once you understand it.
mhm,
Time is simply a rhythm.
mhm,
And what are you going to choose as the instrument that uses that rhythm? Which
mhm,
rhythm are you going to choose? Cesium atoms, aluminum atoms, a pendulum clock, a
mhm,
chemical reaction? What what set of events, the orbit of the Earth around the sun, and
mhm,
all events are going to vary.
mhm,
So there's this claim that events don't vary, that there are natural rhythms that don't vary.
mhm.
That's a big assumption. And Einstein knew it. So I'm sort of saying Einstein lied. He was smart enough, but he lied about his time.
Okay, say it again.
I said Einstein was smart enough to understand that time was setting a standard of rhythmic reactions as your reference. So for him to claim that gravity slowed up time, he was
Mhm,
being dishonest. He knew
mhm.
some reactions actually sped up in gravity.
I
So I'm not
think
saying Einstein was stupid. I'm
I
saying
was reading.
Einstein was dishonest.
Mhm. What about Newton? Isaac Newton or Newton?
Yeah,
Newton.
Isaac
What?
Newton's interesting because I kind of I like Isaac Newton. I'm
No,
not a Newtonian. Yeah,
okay. Newton is
let me
also.
explain. Isaac Newton actually defined space, I think, better than Einstein.
Mhm,
Okay, let me explain this.
mhm,
Isaac Newton said an object at rest
mhm,
will remain at rest unless an outside force is applied.
mhm,
He also said objects in motion
mhm,
will remain in that motion unless an outside force are applied.
mhm,
Okay, so we got two balls stuck together, or
mhm,
my hands.
mhm,
They will stay together unless I apply an outside force. Now, if
mhm.
I apply a force and pull them apart,
Yes. Mhm,
force times distance equals energy.
mhm,
So for me to pull them apart, I need a force, the distance I pull it apart, energy equals force times distance, means I've increased the energy of the system.
mhm,
But if I go measure this, there's no more energy.
mhm,
If I go measure this, there's no more energy in there. So
mhm,
where's the energy? It's in the space between them.
mhm.
Let me repeat this. Isaac Newton said objects at rest will remain at rest unless an outside force is applied.
Yes.
Objects in motion will remain in motion unless a force is applied. So if I apply a force to separate them, force times distance equals energy. This is Isaac Newton. Therefore, I increased the energy of the system. I put in that much energy, the force times the distance. I put with my muscles that much energy into the system. But you can't measure the energy here, and you
Mhm.
can't measure the energy here. So the energy has to be in the space in between.
Mhm.
So
So,
space has to be energy.
so it also implies that we also can measure the energy of the space,
Yeah, the
energy
thing
of the
is,
space.
people, when they're taught physics,
Mhm.
years ago with Aristotle and Pythagoras and
Mhm.
Newton, people used to think on this.
Mhm.
When people take a physics course, all they do is repeat.
Mhm.
They're taught gravity, they're taught time, and all they're doing is repeating. They're not thinking, what is time? What is
Mhm.
gravity? What is space? It's like religion. They
Mhm.
go into the physics class,
Mhm.
the teacher
They,
teaches them, and then they're supposed to repeat. They don't think.
mhm. I think that's how the education system works. You have to memorize stuff and then write it, put it down in the paper. Then you will get better grades, better job, and better life.
Yeah. And
Mm.
today we're under the tyranny not of religion,
Mhm.
but of,
Tyranny of science.
of science.
Mhm.
Science claims to know the truth and they won't let you think.
Mhm. And technology. Technology
Right.
has also
Either
become
you
a new
either
Lord.
you right, either you repeat what the established scientist says, and if you don't repeat it, you're stupid.
Mhm.
You're not allowed to question what science says. You're supposed to assume the universe began with a big bang. If you say no, you're considered uneducated, anti science, because you don't repeat. So science no longer teaches you to think, it teaches you to stop thinking. It teaches
It's
you to repeat what you're taught about time, about space, about Einstein, and Einstein's a genius.
Mhm. And you have to
You're not allowed
conform.
to question Einstein. Who are you to question Einstein? You're some idiot to question Einstein.
Just like in our previous video, we have discussed the expanding universe, how the Earth is expanding.
Well,
It is
supposedly
not.
expanding,
Mhm. Mhm.
but that's based
And
on a more complicated debate of what's called the redshift.
mhm.
And there's other theories about the redshift other than the expansion of space or the movement of the light source. There's other theories about that.
And we have got some proofs from geology to prove this that the Earth is expanding. It's very the rate is very slow, but it is expanding. Just
Well,
like
supposedly it's
it's
expanding,
proof.
but that's based on the measurement of the redshift largely.
Mhm.
I'm
But
not
we get.
saying it's not expanding. What I'm
Mhm.
saying is our definition of time and space is incorrect.
Mhm.
There is no time in the universe. What we do is we choose a reaction as our reference for time, as our
Mhm.
instrument, as our clock.
Mhm.
So time
And
is based on what you choose as your clock.
no, it
Time does
is
not
important.
exist.
Yes, it is important for us to measure and calculate time because we have to do something for to measure and calculate our existence here on this planet and on Earth according to the movement of the rotation of the Earth, and that's how it is
Well,
important for us. But it
well,
is
let me
not.
give you an example. Let me give you an
But
example once you
okay,
start thinking.
because it is not necessary for the universe to have the time. It is
No,
important and necessary for us to calculate time.
suppose our biological clock, we have a biological clock,
Mhm.
and people think it's tuned to light. They think our biological clock is based on winter and summer and fall, But if you live near the equator, you don't have that much of a winter, summer, and fall.
mhm,
And your biological clock, it was based on light. It would be different if you lived in the Arctic as an Eskimo and if you lived in a nomad as in the Sahara, because you
mhm,
have different amounts of light
mhm,
and they have a different type of repetition. So we don't know what our biological clock is based upon. But let me
mhm,
give you an interesting guess.
mhm.
Suppose the biological clock is based on the Earth rotating around the sun
Or gravity.
or gravity.
Mhm,
And suppose on Earth we live to be about 80 years old,
mhm,
but Mars takes twice as long to rotate around the sun. What if you
mhm,
went to Mars? Would you live twice as long? Would you live to be 160? And if you could
mhm,
live on Jupiter, which has more than 10 times the time of the orbit, would you live to be 1,000 years? We
mhm,
assume our lifetime is based on a clock, and it may
mhm.
be based on the orbit around the sun.
It's interesting because I like this theory.
I'm just giving an example of a
Mhm,
different way to guess. All these people are guessing like Big Bang. That's a
mhm,
guess.
mhm,
They want to say no because of the background radiation or because of the redshift and because of the measurements of these galaxies. They've
mhm,
proven the Big
mhm,
Bang. No, they
mhm,
haven't.
mhm,
There's not overwhelming evidence. It's falling apart. So
mhm,
as their theory falls apart, they invent dark energy and dark matter in order to
mhm,
try to hold the crumbling theory together. Because when they went to school, their professors didn't say, I want you to think on this.
mhm,
Their professors say, I want you to repeat what I told you.
mhm.
Because
So, mhm,
Einstein is brilliant.
mhm.
And
No,
even Isaac Newton explained to you the
mhm,
fundamental energy problem,
mhm,
which is to move two bodies apart and have space in between. I just created space between my two hands.
mhm.
But to
So
create that space, I needed energy.
mhm. If we have, if time dilation, if time delays in space, then the biological clock could be true about a lifetime on different planets.
Well, it
If
could be. I'm not saying time dilation in space.
mhm,
Einstein said that, which is
mhm,
Einstein said that
mhm,
gravity is the same as acceleration. So if you went in a rocket that was accelerating and accelerated back, you would experience less time since acceleration is equal to gravity, and you're now under a stronger acceleration or gravity. Time moves slower, and he's assuming the biological clock works the same as his cesium or aluminum clock.
mhm.
That's an
because,
assumption.
because it doesn't.
No, our biological clock may not agree with the clocks they use in physics.
Mhm. Our biological clock is different.
And it may change our biological clock. Two,
Mhm,
300 years ago, people lived to be 40 years old.
mhm,
Now, was that from coal,
mhm,
toxic pollution, lead pipes?
mhm,
Was it from their biological clock was different? Was it from poverty? Was it from their nutrition? I mean, they're different guesses. What
mhm,
has happened in physics, they don't allow guesses anymore.
mhm,
And there's different ways we can look at this, which is space may be energy. And I'll give you an example.
mhm,
Dynamite. When you burn something, it melts. So if I pour gasoline, I drill a hole and pour gasoline and I set it on fire, you're going to see black and maybe not too much melting, depends on the
Mhm.
material. You're going to see the effects of heat.
Mhm.
But if I drill a hole and put dynamite into it
Mhm.
and blow it up, you're not seeing the effects of heat. You're seeing
Mhm.
the effects of expansion of space. The rock doesn't melt. I don't
Mhm.
put that dynamite in a rock,
Mhm.
light it, and it melts the rock. It blows it up. Now we know where the energy is coming from. The energy is coming from the molecular binding or bonds in the dynamite.
Mhm.
But if it created heat, it would melt the rock. You would have like lava.
Mhm.
It doesn't melt the rock, it blows it up. And since I drilled it, there's not much air to heat up. So I drill a
Mhm.
hole in rock, I stick the dynamite in, I I light the dynamite, the rock blows up.
Yes.
There's no heat to expand it.
Mhm.
There's no air, I mean. If it was
So what?
heat, it would
Mhm.
melt the rock. If I pour gasoline into a rock and I burn it, it will only burn where there's oxygen
Mhm.
and it'll get hot. If it was plastic, it would melt.
Yes. So
So
what does it prove?
so it means space is energy. You're some of that the molecular bonds, the energy in the dynamite is turning into space, a rapid
Mhm.
expansion of space. And
Mhm.
that space is expanding so fast it breaks the rock into pieces. It doesn't
Mhm.
melt the rock.
Mhm.
Now that's a different interpretation.
Mhm.
I
I
could be
think.
wrong, but
Mhm.
the way we were taught could be more wrong.
Mhm. Just like in our previous example, we example the two balls that they are stuck into the energy in between them. The space is the energy.
Space is the because it takes energy to move them apart. That's what Isaac Newton predicted.
Mhm. But the Newton's law of motion, law of gravity, also has limitations, and so does the theory of relativity and Einstein's space-time theories also have limitations. So, what is the space-time, or what is the time of
Well,
space?
space time is bullcrap. It's just a made up word, like dark
So,
energy. I can make
mhm,
up a word.
mhm,
Let's call it foggy energy.
mhm,
Let's instead of calling it space time,
mhm.
call it empty time.
Okay.
I mean, it's just making up words and acting like you know something.
Mhm,
Instead of space time, it's empty time.
mhm.
Is space
Because the
empty?
space
We're
doesn't have
supposed to
the.
believe there's these planet and stars.
What about the four dimension of the space?
What about the what?
Four dimension of the space. Three dimension or four dimension of the space.
Well, three dimensions, is right, left, up, and down. The
Mhm,
physical measuring how wide, how high, how long,
mhm. Because
and
when you
there's actually more dimensions.
mhm,
Plus, you can
four
have a
dimension.
drill go clockwise, counterclockwise at an angle. There's a lot of physical dimensions, not just three.
Mhm,
And though you can use a system of points,
mhm,
three-dimensional points to describe any object.
mhm,
So you have three dimensions or 3 points to describe a location on an object. But here I'm going to give to you, they say, well, space is empty. Space is nothing, right? You were taught that space is nothing, it's empty, right?
mhm,
What's 10 times nothing?
mhm.
Nothing.
What is it? Yes,
What's 100 times nothing?
nothing.
You can't measure nothing.
Mhm. So,
Mathematically, if
mhm,
space is nothing, you can't measure it because no matter how many sections of nothing, you still have nothing.
mhm. So if it is nothing, then why is it expanding? Or why the mainstream science tells us that it is expanding?
Well, they tell us it's expanding because of the Doppler shift,
Mhm,
that it looks like the distant galaxies are moving faster away from us because of the light signature. The
mhm,
spectrum we receive from them is shifted towards the red because the speed of light, and Einstein may have been somewhat correct here, the speed of
mhm,
light is constant. So,
mhm,
given the source, as you move away, you're going to get a shift in frequency since you won't get a shift in speed.
mhm,
I don't think that's totally true, but I think that's generally true. I don't want to
mhm,
get into a complicated description of light. I'm just restricting myself here to space and time. And I'm saying space can't be empty or nothing. It at least
mhm,
has the dimension of distance.
mhm. But I think that's why they put time in it in the fourth dimension. When they go to space, they add the fourth element, and the fourth element is time.
Yeah, but as I said, time depends on the instrument you're choosing.
Mhm. Yes.
And a lot of things go back to the same position almost. So, depending on the interval of time you're using, you may or may not detect motion correctly,
Mhm,
like a stroboscope or a
mhm,
strobe. So, we got a lot of problems in physics, but it's not taught to get people thinking and considering other ways of looking at things. It's taught you repeat after me. Here's the truth. Now you repeat it.
mhm. I
And
think that's how the overall the education system works. It's business,
no, not
economics.
all of them. I mean, in literature, you're supposed to be able to read a
Yes.
novel or a play and
Yeah,
come up with
creative.
different interpretations. In
In
painting,
creative,
you're supposed to be able to paint different patterns and colors
just
and try.
just like in music, you create something new. I think science should also be about innovation and creativity. Let new ideas come in.
Right, but the problem is science today is used by the dictators. The
Hmm.
dictators who rule human cultures use
Hmm.
science as if it's religion, that they're teaching you the truth. And if you don't agree, you're stupid.
Hmm. They will
And the
discredit.
reason they get away with it, most people can't disagree intelligently. They can't come up with an idea or theory that's equal to Einstein or Newton. They can't
Mhm.
think on their own, people.
Mhm.
They're lucky, I mean, lucky to
Mhm.
understand someone else's guess like Newton or Einstein. Einstein can make a guess. You're lucky to understand it.
Mhm.
So most people really don't grasp at all the issues.
The concept
And,
of science, different various
right.
concepts of science
And so
and
the
physics.
experts are
Mhm.
experts because they behave and are obedient to those who write their paychecks. The experts are owned by corporations and governments. And if you
Mhm.
disagree, that expert doesn't want to lose their job. They're going to say you're stupid.
Mhm.
And the average person doesn't know enough to understand why someone would disagree with what is said in science.
Mhm. So
So
I
yeah,
think.
it's like with the COVID-19.
Mhm.
A lot of people used to get the flu and die from the so-called influenza. Now everyone supposedly that has a lung infection, it's COVID. The flu
Mhm.
disappeared.
Mhm.
It's not that the flu disappeared. It's different propaganda.
Mhm.
And so
Science. Mhm.
propaganda is pushed as science.
Mhm.
For example,
So
E
we
equals
know it.
mc squared says a
Mhm.
certain amount of mass can be turned into energy.
Mhm.
But no one's turned a proton or an electron into energy. It hasn't been done.
Mhm.
What happens is a neutron is a proton and electron together, and it will
Mhm.
decay and it will emit energy. And
Mhm.
also, the nucleus of an atom is held together by binding forces. And when that atom splits, energy is released.
Mhm.
But that's binding energy. That's not a proton or electron being
Not
changed into
created.
energy.
Mhm.
So people are just taught this stuff, and it's not true. It's like people are
Uh,
taught the sun causes hurricanes.
mhm.
They actually believe the sun causes hurricanes. But you can
Uh,
get a blizzard.
mhm.
You can get a blizzard with 75-mile-per-hour winds. A
Mhm.
blizzard's not caused by the sun.
Mhm.
So people repeat what they're taught, and they don't have the reasoning capability to challenge. And the people who do have the reasoning capability, who do
Mhm.
have the education, when they challenge the experts, which are really controlled by politics, they're
Mhm.
called stupid and they're called a quack. They're crazy.
Mhm.
So someone who's got a PhD in physics who heard me say, "Oh, Ed Konowicz is crazy. What he's saying is totally stupid,"
Mhm.
and people are going to believe them
Yes.
because I don't have a PhD and I'm not on TV. If I had a PhD and was on TV, people would believe me.
Yes.
And I would say, "Don't believe me. I'm giving you a guess."
Yes. It's a guess. It's a different theory, different
It's
way
a
of looking.
different theory. And
Mhm.
it may be equal or better to the guess you learned in school.
Mhm.
So people are only being taught one thing about space and time. And I explained the time is based on the clock you use.
Yeah, it depends upon the instrument and
Right. Depends on,
yeah, and the reaction of the instrument.
yeah. And other
Yes.
things are possible. For
Mhm.
example, if the
Mhm.
Earth was further away from the sun, we may live longer. Our
Mhm.
biological clock may be based on the rotation, not the rotation, but or it could be based on the rotation.
Mhm.
We
Rotation and
have a
move.
biological clock.
Mhm.
We don't know yet what our biological clock is based upon.
Mhm. Because I like
So
this the biological thought clock theory, and I think it could be true, but it's
but
just a theory.
we can't
Mhm.
assume the biological clock is the same as the clock on the wall.
Mhm. It's different.
It's different.
Mhm. And the forces of space, gravity, and the universe are impacting upon our biological clock, not the
Yes.
clock on the wall, the mechanical clock that the physics has invented.
Yeah, for example,
Mhm.
whether it's India
Mhm.
or the Bible,
Mhm.
supposedly people used to live to 2, 3, 4, 500 years of age. It may have been true. We look at it and say it's myth that they couldn't be living to be 300 or 400 years old
Mhm.
because we believe what we're taught.
Mhm.
What we are taught is a guess, and it may be wrong because the political powers are using science as a religion
Mhm.
to control people.
Mhm.
I think that's a lot. I know we're at 45
Yes,
minutes. but I
No,
think that would be
yeah,
overload for most people.
yeah, yeah, it's a bit complicated topic, and there's so much to learn from it, and we have come up with new ideas, and there are so many new ideas and unorthodox way of discussing time and space. And thank you for enlightening me and for giving so many examples and biological clock and the reaction of the instrument and time and space. And thank you guys for listening and watching. Those who have watched or still watch or watch later. And if you have any question, let's leave it in the comment box. I'll answer to you or I will get back to you as soon as I can. And thank you and have a good day, good night, wherever you are.